Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Gilpin and Sheila Greenwell, who are going to speak about the history and details of knitted Ganseys. So, Di, it's over to you. Thank you.
Hi. Well, this is just so exciting. We're here in our studio at Familial Farm, which is very close to Anster, in fact. And we're sat upstairs with one or two garments behind us, some kind of more modern interpretations of Gansey, and there's actually a beautiful traditional Gansey there, which is part of my collection. I thought I'd start by, first of all, introducing Sheila, who's she's my right-hand woman. She's my left-hand woman as well.
Partner in crime.
Partner in crime. And I'd also like to explain why I became so fascinated by Ganseys, the Gansey stories, where it started, and then talk a little bit about the history that Sheila and I have been working on for what seems like years now. And then I'm going to show you some case studies of work that we've done in fashion, because we do a lot of fashion work from the studio, because there is a huge fascination amongst designers with Gansey because of the amazing construction of each piece, because of all the patterning, the design, the combination of the utilitarian with the beautiful. So I think that's really where we're going to go today. And we've got some lovely little samples to show you from designs, patterns from the East Neuk of Fife, which is where we're based right here at the moment, and also some work from a project I was involved in about 10 years ago now, the Moray Firth Gansey project. So we've got one or two things from there as well. So anyway, yeah, so I grew up, I was born in Bridlington, and I grew up for my first few years in a tiny village outside Filey, near the famous Bempton Cliffs. And my dad, he knew a lot of the fishermen down in Filey. And in fact, he not only bought fish from them, because as a youngish man, he had the first mobile fish and chip shop in East Yorkshire. And he and Mum used to head off round all the little villages with the fish that he'd pick up, you know, from the fishermen, and then they cook it. I shudder with horror at the thought of Mum frying chips in between villages, but they did. And Dad also used to supply all the calagas for the boys that go out to protect the coastline, you know, for the sailors, for fishermen. He'd go out on a boat and replace all the gas canisters to make sure that everything was well lit. So he knew them pretty well, and I got to know, you know, the children and grandchildren of some of the fishermen, the Crimlisks, and some of the other families. So I suppose in my consciousness, being down at the harbour on the beach, it's not really a harbour, but down in Filey, the kind of Ganseys were always part of my life. And I was an avid knitter. I learned very, very young. I mean, Sheila, you learned very young as well, didn't you?
I did, yes. Yeah. I come from a wool town, quite different from Di. I come from Hoyk. So I didn't have her advantage of growing up on the coast or seeing so much of Ganseys, but I've tried to make up for that in the last 10 years.
Certainly have. So yeah, I mean, we both learned very young, and Sheila joined me quite a long time ago now. And one of the first things that we discovered about each other is that we knit in exactly the same way. So I knit with a needle under my arm like this, and also that we absolutely love knitting on sets of long double-pointed needles. And some of the knitters watching now will groan, because there's so many people scared of knitting in the traditional way with these long steel. These came from Shetland needles, but they are absolutely essential to get a really good tension and to be able to knit in the round and knit seamlessly, which is what the Gansey is all about. It's about its construction, which is what I began to learn as a young person, and really from quite a young age. In fact, my very first knitting pattern book I bought when I was maybe about 11 years old with my Auntie Doris, who was a great knitter, and I have it here. I've got several copies now because I love it so much, and it's the sort of thing I used to read under the covers with a torch at night when I shouldn't have been reading. It's Gladys Thompson's Patterns for Ganseys, Jerseys and Arons, which was originally written in the 50s. And there've been quite a few really brilliant books written about Ganseys over the years. And, you know, there's a lot been written about what the history is. There's actually quite a lot of dispute about what Ganseys really are. And so Sheila and I have decided over the last few years to try and find out as much as we can about where patterns come from, to try and explode the myths about whether you know, an individual village had its own patterns, whether individual families had their designs that, you know, they were known for. And Sheila's in the process of knitting. I think she's just gone over the 100th sample of patterns that we've looked at and picked up and found from not only the Moray Firth Gansey project, which did a huge amount of work to preserve the Ganseys and the history from Aberdeen up to Wick, but also from more recently from the collection which is now housed at the Scottish Fisheries Museum in Anster, so that the collection that was already there from this area's Ganseys is now being incorporated with that and hopefully working towards creating a national collection. So I thought maybe we should talk about what it was that really fascinated me from the beginning. And I think I can only describe that as the hand of the knitter, the hand of the maker. That I'll describe what a Gansey is. A Gansey is really, it's workwear, and it was made in a very specific type of yarn. Although there are variations, obviously, you know, all over the place, but generally with a worsted spun 5-ply yarn. That's post-industrialization, when it was starting to be produced in mills. And this yarn was very, very dense, very tightly spun, 5 strands, and knitted on really quite fine needles. So the needles that I was showing you, these are 2.25 millimeter. They are very fine. And what that meant was that the Gansey stitches became incredibly dense, and they also popped out of the flat pattern, so you could see the patterns of the design. So we have a beautiful one here, which is actually from the Moray Firth Gansey project. That's the double diamond from Banff. And you can see here also these lovely little ladders running down, which we call joining stitches. And through the years of researching this, I began to realize that those joining patterns are actually even more important to a degree than the bigger patterns that you see in some of the Ganseys, typical maybe of Filey or the north of Scotland or wherever. That those little joining patterns to a knitter, they are very personal. And we've found that some knitters have specific patterns, little patterns that are only seen in their family's Ganseys, which I think is quite an important discovery, because, you know, there's been a lot of debate about the book that I showed you from the 50s, about people taking patterns from there and using them, and I suppose muddying the mix of patterns around the coast. So what we've actually discovered is that people did have their own little signatures, but they maybe weren't in exactly the way that people now looking back thought they were. So for example, 2 years ago at an exhibition to do with Ganseys. A woman got very excited during a workshop and came back the next day with a large box of 5 Ganseys and a file of papers, which were all from her grandmother, great-grandmother, auntie's family from this one fishing village in the north of Scotland, and scribbled down, going back to the 1820s, were patterns and notes for the family to be able to use those little patterns. So they were like a directory for the family. Now, many people said the patterns weren't written down at all, that it was all done just by, you know, internal knowledge of the making. And that is true to an extent. You know, there's lots of stories about, you know, a woman eyeing up her new son-in-law and kind of saying, oh, well, he's a 462, meaning it would need 462 stitches knitted in the round on 4 needles to make his 42-inch chest perfect. And she didn't measure him, she just got the knowledge in her head, and she would cast that on, and then she'd make up, she'd add in, particularly in those little joining sections that I was talking about, she'd either expand them because she needed a few more stitches on her needles, or she'd shrink them to make the size of the garment work. So I suppose when we went into the museum in Anster a few months ago, when lockdown had started to slightly ease, and we had made a template for how we would record each Gansey, and we asked lots of people to put their thoughts on this. So Matthew Topsfield from Eriskay, because Eriskay is also involved in this project, Stephanie Hoyle, who'd been involved in the Moray Firth project. We asked everybody to add things in, but also to specifically this time record information about those joining stitches and also tensions and the tension of each Gansey. So just to give you a feel for it, about how important these garments are, when we handled them, and of course we had our gloves on, but when we handled them, you actually get a sense of the maker, of the person who has hand knitted for hours and hours and hours this incredibly dense, beautiful piece of knitting. And you see their mistakes, and you see as they're progressing how they change the garment. And do you want to say a little bit about that, Sheila? Because it was fabulously exciting when we realised that.
Well, I was hugely interested in how Tam's Gansey, which he wore up in the Arctic,
Yes,
in the Arctic convoys, I was so interested in how his mother had started and had cast on and had done the rib and then moved into the pattern, and then for whatever reasons she had done her first set of diamonds and then moved on to the second, and then she changed her mind because she must not have liked the effect. But because it was down at the bottom of the jersey, she certainly wasn't going to pull it all out and start again, because that's not the part of the jersey that people see. People look up here, don't they?
And that would have been hours of work anyway.
Hours and hours already. So she actually, and I just thought this showed such a degree of confidence and experience. It was amazing. So she did another couple of diamonds, and she tried out another couple of variations, and she found the one that she liked and she went with it.
And you see, only knitters can really see those sorts of details by looking at the stitch count and the rows and where the knitter has placed the design.
Yes, you have to be able to read.
You're kind of reading.
You read
like
what's in front of you.
You're reading a book,
like
or poetry or whatever, you're seeing where the person has thought, I need to change this. And there was also the incredible decreases, because the thing about a Gansey is that you start at the bottom and you knit up, and you knit these amazing gussets under the arms, and they're there principally to allow an expansion for the chest area and to allow lots of movement, because these were for fishermen working out on the sea, and they didn't want to get themselves caught up in any of the ropes or hooks or anything like that, because that would be very dangerous. So Ganseys tended to have slightly shorter sleeves and very tightly fitted, really fitted. People had to be pulled out of them when they got back if they'd been on a boat for any length of time at all, because they wouldn't have taken them off. They were just on. Once it was on, they were on. And so getting that fit, which is, I'll talk about later, is how it translates into fashion, because in fashion, everything is about fit. Getting that fit meant that when you'd done your underarm gusset, you left half of it on a piece of thread, and you knitted the front and then the back, and then you would join it either with a saddle or a 3-needle bind off or all sorts of different things up here. But then you would pick up the armhole and your bit of gusset and knit the sleeve downwards, so there's no sleeve, and you could make the sleeve as long as you needed it to be. It also meant if it got worn, you could cut it off and knit it back down, so you had a repair. You could repair it very easily. Now, in one of these Ganseys that we saw, it was quite magical, because the first sleeve had been knitted, and underneath here there's all these beautiful decreases as it gets narrower down to the bottom, and she'd started off very regularly and it was looking great, but obviously she hadn't cast off enough stitches, and it was probably a little bit too wide, so she started doing random decreases, which we found, which were great.
We could see them, and we did wonder what they were, because it was in an otherwise plain piece of knitting, so they were actually quite obvious. There was no pattern there to hide it, but we soon worked out what her little problem was, and the way that she was resolving it. And so that was on what must have been the first sleeve.
Yes, it was,
because the second sleeve
was perfect. The second, she'd learned by her mistake.
She must have just made a wee mental note to herself, and knew that she had to adjust the stitches that she picked up at the armhole, and knitted it absolutely perfectly.
So her second Gansey was perfect.
Second sleeve. Yeah.
So, and then she made another Gansey, and the second Gansey was absolutely perfect. She'd learned all of these things and put them to good use.
Yes.
And it's that understanding of the knitter's mind, which is really interesting, because, you know, they're knitted in the round, so they're actually sculptural pieces. You're not only making a garment, you're making a sculpture to a degree, and you're also making the fabric just from one length of wool and your needles. And by making the knit stitch, you're actually creating fabric. And so the gussets can also be at the neck, and you can have, and sometimes you can have little buttons at the neck. There's lots of different variety in necks. There's lots of different varieties in the saddles, in the shoulder sections here. Some are knitted up, and then they have like a double row here of garter stitch, and then an internal decrease, so you can't see it, which is incredibly clever. So I suppose over the years, I started to think about the use of tension within the knitting, and of how this creates a fabric which actually moves with the body. And I think this is one of the crucial things about it, that the wool with the body, it can expand and then go back into shape. And because of the nature of the stitch and how they integrate each other, it actually allows for that movement. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes stitches sit up,
Yeah.
and sometimes they disappear,
Yeah.
which makes life just a little bit more interesting. I have here, I hope people can see it, this most beautiful tree is in a magnificent Gansey in the Scottish Fisheries Museum in Anster. Di and I had never seen a tree knitted in quite this way before. The tree is one of the fairly widespread symbols used by Gansey knitters, but this is such a beautiful, elegant tree, and we were amazed to find it in Anster and to be able to spend time with it that afternoon. It was amazing. But you can see perhaps that as I pull out just a little bit, it stretches, and so there are stitches hidden there that suddenly become apparent, and it changes shape, and it would do that with, you know, the body of the wearer. So that's the other thing about Ganseys, not just the shape, the fit, the construction, but also the stitch patterns that people choose to use.
Yes, absolutely. And we have found that a great many of these patterns originated in the north of Scotland and travelled the coast, because of course a lot of these fishermen were travelling with the herring and with the herring trade around the coast. The herring would appear around Shetland, and boats from all over the coast would kind of gather there. There are incredible photographs in the Shetland Museum of the harbour absolutely full of herring boats. And then they would literally follow the herring down the coast, and they would catch it, and then they'd come into port and they'd salt it, and the herring girls would come, they'd gut and salt in, and put the herring into barrels all the way down the coast from the north of Scotland, right the way down, even round to Cornwall. So there's a huge tradition of Gansey knitting, which kind of followed the herring. And there's some on Eriskay as well, and
which has a different, it has a different tradition of patterning.
It does. We've discovered quite a different tradition, really quite significantly different. And we've discovered that a lot of the patterns for Familial and the coastline where I grew up, a lot of those originated in Scotland and came down. And people have made them
They have made them their own. There are all sorts of variations that an experienced knitter can make. They can add an extra stitch in, they can take one out, they can play around a bit with the joining stitches and so on. But we are always excited when we see something from a particular knitter that we don't see anywhere else. And if anyone has seen this anywhere else, then I expect that we'll hear about it
let us know
very soon this evening. But again, I don't know if you can see this, but these beautiful little cables that run up either side of the central chevron are mock cables. And again, thanks to Stephanie Hoyle up in Inverness for helping us with this. And these come from the hand of a particular knitter called Elsie Buchan. And we love Elsie Buchan.
We do.
Don't we?
Elsie is a star. She
is an amazing knitter, and everything that she has knitted is absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. But these little mock cables are her trademark.
They're her own special device. I mean, I sometimes call them devices because they have allowed the knitter to give their own feel to a Gansey, their own stamp onto the Gansey, and they can, sometimes those little mock cables, we've seen them in twos, and sometimes we've seen them in two separated, sometimes we've seen them in threes. And so we're seeing like progressions, and knitters have used these progressions to size their garments and to make them smaller or bigger, depending on who is actually going to be wearing it, which is quite fascinating. So what I thought I would do now is show you some slides, because there's going to be plenty of time to chat to us, you know, and ask us questions. You know, as I said earlier, I could go on chatting with Sheila for hours.
We do.
We do that. But it probably would be good to move on to some of the little case studies that I've put together to show you how we can use all of this knowledge. And it's almost, in a sense, is keeping the knowledge of the Gansey alive. And that's the main reason for all of this, is to keep all that knowledge, which goes back an awfully long way, to keep it alive and vibrant in, you know, the world we live in now. So I'm going to switch screens, and I hope I get this right.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. I'm going to share a screen here. And you should now hopefully see the first photograph, which is obviously of a boat, because I love boats, and the knitting in the sea and everything that describes what we're going to try and explain. So at the left, at the top, that's the graph paper that we use, that I use quite a lot. I've just got to see if this will move over. This is how I now do a lot of my charts, because obviously I'm sharing the patterns and wanting people to make them. But this particular design was one of the first big fashion commissions that I had to work with a company called Mead & Kirchhoff, who were putting together a show for London Fashion Week for the autumn winter. And they came to me, I think, in December of 2011 and said to me, well, we want to do this show at the end of February, and we need 12 Ganseys made. And we love Ganseys. We know all about them. They're fabulous. And I said, oh, great. Yeah, well, fine. And so I set about making these contemporary Ganseys, and this was one of the first charts that I drew up, and I threw everything into it, like an Erskine Gansey, something like that. And this is how it ended up, because what they actually wanted, and Sheila knitted this, they wanted this large heart with a witch flying across the front of the Gansey. Now, any of you that have actually made a Gansey will know that, and knows about intarsia knitting, will know that to create a white heart on the front of a Gansey where you're still knitting in the round is pretty much impossible, because intarsia and knitting in the round don't work together. So we had to think out of the box, and so I created a way of knitting on the surface of the Gansey to create the white heart.
And we kept our fingers crossed.
We kept our fingers crossed. That is, they sent me a drawing of a witch, so I superimposed it onto the Gansey, and poor Sheila had to do the knitting for it. This was another Gansey which made it to the catwalk, and I have to say 4 of the pieces from this collection were in 4 different issues of Vogue magazine and were absolutely adored. This was the red Gansey, but incorporated into the pattern section were words as well. So it had graffiti, it was graffitied. but it had the perfect fit. It was knitted entirely in the round with gussets, the whole thing. And here is really interesting. There's a Gansey round the woman's shoulders, but if you notice that she's wearing these beautiful red knitted tights. So as the commission expanded and we set off to make, I think, 8 pieces, we ended up making 46 pieces for the collection. So that included 6 pairs of tights, with obviously with the feet in, and featuring gussets, because they had to be knitted totally in the round. And so I created a gusset, and then beautiful, this one has lovely lace patterns. And of course, here we are, if you can see those. This is a pair of tights, of leggings from that collection. And I used some of the Eriskay patterns, the print of the hoof in lace, which you only really see any lace work in Ganseys in Eriskay, in the Sunday best Ganseys, or that were knitted for the cooperative, which started in about 1976. Because I don't think most fishermen would actually go to sea wearing a lacy sweater. But anyway, they make perfect tights. And so the application of the gusset to allow for seamless construction of tights, leggings, and other things is just one of the ways that the modern, the Gansey has gone into a kind of modern collection. That's just a little pair of them there. You can see the beautiful Tree of Life pattern with some lovely little joining stitches, and then the print of the hoof. Now, that is seen in different ways, but I always understood it to mean that it was from a place where the boats were taken out across a strand of sand to be launched, rather than from a harbour. So it literally is the print of the hoof of the horse on the sand. And what we did with these, and this is where it becomes really interesting, to get the shape for the tights, and to make sure, like tights, that you could pull them open, pull them on, and then they would fit to the body almost like an elastic, so that they actually moved with the body. So I started experimenting with lots of different sizes of these needles, starting off with very fine ones, going to larger ones to pull out the tension, and then going down to even smaller, finer ones, so that it got denser and denser. And the beautiful thing is that you wore them, and then if you washed them, they just went straight back into the original shape. So moving on from that, we got to a project with just straight afterwards, actually, I had to close the studio for 6 months and work with a really well-known sports manufacturer and quite iconic label in the States. And they flew over a team to work with us to look at Gansey knitting and how it could be applied to other things. And so these were the drawings that I did for some running shoes. And the concept for these was that they would be knitted entirely in Gansey, and they'd be knitted seamlessly. And that I created a story in my head from the Chariots of Fire because of the beach in St Andrews where it was filmed. So I put the beautiful wings in there and the print of the hoof pattern running down the centre with some beautiful little joining patterns. And that's one of my first drawings for it. And you can see this was for the little lacing up the middle. And then Sheila created from the drawings charts for the shoes, And you can see here the print of the hoof, beautiful joining patterns and little mini cables for like the rigging from boats and things like that. And then my own kind of, you know, like flames coming off the runners' feet as they ran through the sand. And this was for another one, for a menswear piece. And I created the Oregon pine symbol for that to match the company's ethos and where they come from, along with the hazard signs. And we put anchors into this. So we were working on incredibly tiny needles using the absolute traditional 5-ply Gansey yarn. And there you can see the first pair that was lasted in Vietnam of the shoes, of this particular pair of shoes. And that's it from the top. And the only thing that was not, it was just a little tongue, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That was knitted separately and applied. The rest is completely seamless. It was knitted from the back
round to the
edge
front.
with a double cast on, so you could knit one way and the other, and then join it all up when you got round to the front. Now, the important thing about this was that Luke Hammer, who was the main technical guy for the company, spent 2 days with me, and I said to him, you know, why are you using woven fabric for running shoes? Because the knit stitch, as I was describing earlier, has got stretch. And that means that for an athlete, you can move your foot with the knitted fabric, and rather than with the woven fabric there being no movement, the actual nature of the knitting stitch in that density will allow your foot to move much more, much better. So in fact, they turned their attention away from woven running shoes and created the first knitted running shoes. And the very first ones had some of the Gansey patterns incorporated into them. So we're hoping at some point to make a small collection of these, because they really were rather lovely little things, weren't they? Beautiful things. This was for some of the big bomber jackets that I made for them. And again, I've put in the Oregon pine. This is for the saddle for a bomber jacket, which had leather down at each side. So this was the sleeve. And we had to then send the knitted pieces to a special company in New York who added the leather to the jacket. And these were originally for the 2012 London Olympics for the American team. But unfortunately, this company didn't get the commission, and somebody else did. So they're in a collection at the moment, waiting to be used, hopefully.
Waiting to see the light of day.
And these are some of the charts again that I use, and you can see all the kind of decreases and the complexity of the knit that you have to do the maths, the endless maths to actually get the fit right, which is obviously an enormous part of hand knitting. So then this is a very contemporary Gansey, which was made in collaboration with a Scottish company, Hancock VA, and this was for a collection which went to Japan. And here I used a almost modern honeycomb stitch, and I extended it and then shrank it depending on how much, because with honeycomb and with cabling, it pulls fabric in and makes it much tighter. So Sheila's devised an amazing way of increasing stitches just where the cabling starts, so that there is no change in the fabric at each side. It doesn't billow out, it stays nice and flat. So these again were knitted with lovely gussets, knitted totally in the round.
And a form of saddle shoulder.
Yes.
In that we accentuated the shoulder by changing the stitch and kept that going into the neck.
Yeah, which is really nice and really nice integration. And so there you can see the kind of very modern look for a young guy. And, you know, the important thing is that with the gusset and with that stretch, for young men particularly who've been going to the gym or are really much more body conscious than they used to be, the Gansey fit is absolutely, they love it. It's so brilliant. They feel very comfortable in it. So it's because, you know, there's a lot of potential for using this brilliant fit for younger people and encouraging them to wear them, which I'm really, really keen on. These are some of the charts and me working at them, and I'd use a pencil and each stitch is marked, you know, as how I want it to be. In this case, this is all the little filled in dot, which represents a pearl stitch on a knitted fabric. So you can see some of the Gansey ones here.
This one here is actually for the piece that's on the mannequin behind you right now.
Oh, well, you can't.
Can't
you
see it.
that?
Oh, well, we'll show you later. We'll show you later.
Yeah. So that's kind of an exploration of lots of the different designs and patterns that you see. Now, recently, well, the last several years, we've been working with a Glasgow, Paris company called La Fetiche, and we work on the design side and then on the production for these pieces. And the designer April Crichton is really interested in workwear, and so as a lot of designers are, and so this has got lots of elements of Gansey knit within it, but taken out of context and used in a slightly different way. So here you can see the lovely gusset underarm, which is in bright pink. I thought I'd just throw that in because it shows you how you know, kind of things are adapting and changing. And again, here we've got the great classic neck gusset, which is a wonderful tool for stopping a neck here, actually grating against somebody here, chafing them. Traditionally, they were knitted straight across at the top. That meant that they could catch here. So the side gusset in the neck actually pushes the neck forward so it didn't chafe and didn't react, you know, with the skin. There's a lovely example of a bright pink gusset. No, bright blue, sorry. I'm not colourblind, honestly. Bright blue. And here you've got the gusset in a pair of leggings that we made for this company as well. And I thought I'd just put this in because you can see how beautifully they work. There's absolutely no seams in this at all. And the bit that I'm particularly proud of is the where the ribbing ends, the designer wanted a cord inserted so that it could be tied. And so again, we used the technique of doubling up all the stitches on, and then taking half and knitting on separate needles one way and half knitting the other way, and then joining them back together to make a tube so that then the cord could be passed through. Again, with the principle of not allowing any seam to chafe against the body. And so this is one of the most recent that we've done for Studio La Fetiche. And again, it's got neck gussets, underarm gussets.
It's got the shoulder, very traditional Gansey shoulder.
A Gansey shoulder on it, and the shorter sleeves. And it's knitted quite densely, so it's got actually got a lovely shape. We've used needle changes to create that the shape in the body. And this is one of our own takes on a Gansey. So this is the polar Gansey, and I felt there needed to be a Gansey for women to navigate a boat up to the Arctic. And so I've made a compass in this, and the lovely rigging which goes up to the shoulder. This is to show you the sleeve, how we've picked up and we're knitting down now. And then we'll finish off the neck afterwards. Those stitches are left live and are not cast off. So that then goes up into the neck. And there you can see the detail of the cast off at the 3-needle cast off at the shoulder, and some of the lovely ribbing and some of the patterning in the Gansey. And that's the one that you can see behind us, the Moray Star, which again is knitted in the round. And this time I've brought some lace work in at the top to give a very feminine edge to the piece, and used lots of different needle changes so that it fits the body very nice and tightly. And so that is the end of all our photographs, I think, for now. So I'm going to stop sharing this and hopefully come back. Hi everyone. Actually at this point I thought I'd say, if anybody's got any questions, you know, if there's things that we haven't covered that people would like to know more about, we're really happy to sit here and chat away. Sheila, do you just want to show the marriage lines?
The marriage lines.
Just I think we've got these.
Well, we did. Yesterday when we were planning this, I had what I thought was a clever idea of just talking a little bit about a bit of the coastline that we know from here up to, say, Aberdeen. So you know, we were going to have the tree from Anster, and then we were going to have these famous marriage lines from Arbroath. So the two lines going along side by side are supposed to they're supposed to reflect the vicissitudes, I suppose, the ups and downs, ins and outs of married life. And tradition has it that only married sailors, seamen, were allowed to wear the marriage lines. There are lots of variations on them, though, that anyone could wear. And then finally, the other one I've already shown you with the mock cables and the chevron. So that actually comes from Peterhead, where a lot of the most amazing knitting and patterns came from. And there's also a lot from Wick. I love the patterns from Wick. They have beautiful
symmetry.
The symbols are beautiful. The most beautiful anchor pattern, in my opinion, comes from Wick. So yeah, we could go on at length.
Super. Thanks very much, Di and Sheila. That was brilliant. We have had a few comments come into the chat box. I'm not sure any of them are questions, but I'll read them in a moment. But if anybody has got any questions they want to either put in the chat box or give me a wave. So in terms of the comments in the chat box, we've got Addy saying how fascinating that the traditional knitting should be used in running shoes. Dottie would love to get them to display in the museum for one of the future events in Alaska. And Lorraine just saying that it's so beautiful, which is very true. So has anybody got any questions for Di and Sheila? Oh, so Alicia is asking, who is doing your knitting, your samples?
Sheila.
I'm doing a lot of the knitting at the moment. I'm not doing it all, but for all the samples that I've been holding up for you, we need to do quite a few for January because we have a commission, and I felt very early on that they should all be done by the same knitter. And although Di and I share a very similar tension and way of knitting, she also has the company to run, which I don't. So I have more time to do the knitting. So
and also because we're working with other companies, we're designing other pieces, would working on samples for autumn winter collections, spring summer collections, our own patterns. I kind of sit there drawing out ideas and working on the grading, the sizing, the pattern writing and the technical side, the maths side, to make sure everything works. And I just have a shout out here for maths because, you know, I love maths, and if my maths teacher from school were to hear me say that, he would be absolutely shocked. But maths, I've discovered through knitting, is the most beautiful thing in the world. And I know when something is right, and it's like a light bulb moment, and all the numbers work, and you know then that you've got it. You're onto a winner.
And it's particularly true in some of the Gansey patterning,
yes,
isn't it?
It is,
because it's so symmetrical. What we have found in the course of our researches and with me knitting all these samples is that, and I have always known this, that the symmetry of these designs is amazing, and they all swivel around one central stitch, except for a few, and we actually have one here, a sample that comes from Hopman. Is it Hopman?
Port Soy.
I beg their pardon. So this is a very unusual one, and it also comes from this. It's used down on the Norfolk coast in Sheringham as well, where it's not one single stitch down at the bottom of each diamond. I don't know if you can see it, but it's actually 2 stitches. And everywhere else on the patterning, it pivots around a single stitch, but here it's 2. And we find this amazing that someone has chosen to do it differently. And it completely, it means that you have to recalculate everything.
And one thing that we have discovered, which is fascinating, is that people who borrowed patterns from this book that I was talking about, the Gladys Thompson book, people have known for a long time that there are errors in the book. In fact, the first time I found one about 20 years ago, I was shaken to the core because I was distraught because it's such a Bible for me. But we have discovered that, you know, people have taken patterns from here and replicated them, and actually they're wrong because the original things, patterns and charts she put in here were wrong.
Not some.
Not a lot, but
no.
There's just 1 or 2 that are quite important ones that are actually incorrect. And so as a historian, which is how I originally trained, it's fascinating because it's like primary source material and secondary source material, and how if the primary source material is misinterpreted, then the myth of that goes on and on and on until somebody spots it, maybe 70 years later. So it's fascinating, you know, kind of historically looking for things like that.
Yeah, we found 1 or 2.
1 or 2.
Thanks, Di. Got a question here from Fiona. Fantastic talk, thank you, so interesting. Could you say more about the garment, how the garment can hold such structure when not seamed? Also, whether the contemporary versions you have still use worsted yarn or other weights?
Well, to answer the worsted yarn question, in fact, we found in the collections that traditionally people mostly or often used worsted, but people also used ordinary double knit and woolen spun. And I suppose it's a question of money sometimes, or what you have to hand. So, you know, there's no, you know, the 5-ply Gansey wool obviously works brilliantly, but people have used other things. They keep their structure because of the density of stitches, and some of the older Ganseys that I was looking at have maybe 60 stitches to 10 centimeters, which is really, really, really dense. And that makes a fabric that yes, it has the stretch physically for the body, but it doesn't stretch otherwise. It doesn't grow longer. It doesn't, you know, it just stays exactly.
Maybe if you look at the stocking stitch, you can
It does
see
what
more
it
clearly.
should. It does what it should, says it should. So this is one, and you can see there, and you can see that also see, I don't know if you can see this, the beautiful, you can't really, because that's why we mostly are doing things in other colours. But
yes, not we avoid the navy for explaining explanatory purposes, but of course the navy was
and this
one of the
Gansey
traditional colours.
is 60, 70 years old and looks and has stayed exactly the same. There's no change in it at all. So does that answer that to a degree? I mean, we've used lots of different materials. I'm using a fantastic cashmere at the moment. I'm using a fabulous linen. Linen holds Gansey patterns really, really, really well. So you definitely wouldn't want to knit a Gansey in anything that was like a hairy fibre that had like a mohair in it, or anything that was soft. It needs to be well plied so that the stitches pop out of the material, so you do see the patterning. Otherwise it just doesn't work. So and you'd also mostly use a single colour rather than like a mild yarn, where again it would get lost in the knit. The very first Gansey I made for somebody was on Skye, and I actually hand spun all the yarn for it myself with a drop spindle and knitted it and sold it. And because that's when I had my first studio in 1983 in a very remote bit of Skye. And I realized incredibly quickly that I would not be able to feed myself if I were to knit Ganseys, to spin the yarn and knit them, because they are a labour of love, really.
Super, thank you. Question here from Penny. Oh, Elizabeth, do you want to jump in first rather than keep your hand up? You'll have to unmute yourself first. No? Okay. So a question from Penny here. Do we know if your knitted running shoes for an Oregon sportswear company preceded Fly Knit for another Oregon sportswear company, and how do companies typically find you?
Well, they possibly did. I think that's pretty much on the button. So they found us through partly through the Moray Firth Gansey project, which I designed that project, and I you know, kind of wrote a brief for it, and somebody had contacted them and they said, well, maybe you need to talk to Di about possibilities. So in fact, the Anster, the Fisheries Museum, very kindly lent me some of their Ganseys and for my studio, and the Moray Firth Gansey project lent me some, and I had my own collection, and they came to my studio for 2 days and we taught Ganseys for 2 days, which was amazing. It was wonderful. So people find us mostly by word of mouth, particularly in industry, because we don't advertise really. It's mostly people saying, well, you know, if you want to have some hand knit, go and talk to Di, because we have made some really iconic pieces for lots of different companies that almost kind of like they spearhead campaigns, because the hand knit has got so much love and attention in it that it speaks to people, you know, really, it speaks more than anything else, I think, I feel. And yeah, so I think that's, yeah, I think the BBC ran an article about us a few years ago, which said, what was it, basically the company that you should know about but nobody knows about, and how they get to be known about, and it was all just word of mouth.
Got a comment here, well, a question from Jen Gordon from the Fisheries Museum. She says the polar Gansey is exquisite and conjures up atmospheric scenes of icy waters. It would be nice to see it in the V&A Dundee with the connection of the city to Arctic whaling. She says she knows that she should know this, but did whalers wear Ganseys?
They did, but sometimes, yeah, they did, absolutely, unquestionably. If they were sailing out of Dundee or wherever, they would have done. They're perfect, you know, for that sort of very difficult exploration, you know. And you know, if you think about getting trapped in the ice or whatever, you needed something. I mean, there are some fairly fearful stories told by Stella Ruhr from Holland, about the deep sea fishermen, and they had Ganseys, and mostly the idea is that they came from the fact they'd met Scottish fishermen and they started wearing Ganseys themselves, and they're simpler versions, but they would wear them, and when they got home, when they got back after maybe 3 months, sadly they would be pulled out of the Gansey and their flesh would come away with them, with the Gansey, and they'd have sores on the body and some would be hospitalized from it. And that shows you what a dangerous job and a difficult job the fishing was and still is, you know, and people lose their lives, you know, regularly doing it. So one thing I'd like to say, which is the main driving force behind a lot of the design work that I do with Gansey, is that I see it as a very protective piece of clothing. And I think in the modern world, you know, with a very difficult, complex world we live in, that if people can have a Gansey, you know, and live like my grandchildren or family in Brooklyn and New York, if they have their piece of Gansey that they're wearing, they're being protected wherever they are. And the hand of the knitter, the person that made it with love, is surrounding and cocooning them in a difficult world. So I think that's why the Gansey has got such an important place in our social history, but also in the future, in the, you know, as we go forward. That's my feeling.
And with that in mind, I'm going to jump down. I'm skipping a few questions, but I'll come back to them. Lorraine has asked, would the patterning on a Gansey ever work like a tattoo to identify a fisherman? And I think there are stories.
Yes, lots of stories about this. There's lots of stories about this. One story personally that I heard from my father in Filey was that some young lads had been washed ashore and had been identified. There was a tragedy, 3 young boys, their boat overturned, and because Filey has a big strand of sand, they had wellies on, and it was very stormy, and the sand filled and water filled up their wellies and they drowned, and they knew immediately when they came ashore who they were. So that was from my dad, you know, many years ago. Now, a lot of people have disputed that, and, you know, quite rightly, it's not, as to a historian, it's not written down anywhere. But I think that as we were trying to describe the individuality in the making of each of these Ganseys, a family would know. They would know the hand of the family member that had made a particular Gansey. So I think there's every possibility that that would help identify people, because it doesn't wear, you know, they would have stayed pretty much intact. Just to tell you a story, when I lived on Skye years ago, as a very young person, and I was trying to run my studio and be a knitter and couldn't make very much money. So I used to do what they call winkle on the shore, collect winkles all year round, and particularly in the winter months when the winkle price was very high, and they would get exported to France, to the market, to Les Halles in Paris. And I had a hat I'd made for doing this, and it was made from Harris yarn that I'd twisted up myself, the weaving yarn, and I'd knitted it with a nice big turn up, and inside it I'd put some expensive loppy yarn so it wasn't itchy against my forehead. and I must have put it down on a rock because I got really hot, and it got washed away, and I was devastated. But anyway, I had to go back and make another one. Anyway, about a year later, I was down on the shore again, different spot on my headland, round at the other side, and washed up in the seaweed was my hat. And it was absolutely perfect. So it had been bobbing around in the ocean for quite a while. So I took it home and gave it a quick wash and
Stuck it back on your
stuck
head.
it back on my head and wore it for another 10 years.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions from Addy here. First one, you mentioned that there are places that produce particularly beautiful designs like Peterhead and Wick.
Mm.
Why is this, do you think? Particularly talented knitters who pass the patterns down the generations?
Yes, I think that's part of it. Absolutely, definitely.
And the prevalence of the fleet up there, because like Shetland, there are stories. I have a good friend who grew up in Wick, and she can remember times when the harbour was so full of boats that you could just walk across the whole area without getting your feet wet. Mm-hmm. Yes, the whole of the harbour. And I think it was just the amount of knitting that was being done there would be part of the story. Mm-hmm. But as we've been doing our research, certainly Wick has yes. really come forward as a source of amazing, beautiful patterning that I hadn't really been so
I hadn't been so aware of. Mm-hmm. And of course, Cornwall has a very different style, and we've really seen how different it is by looking at patterns and samples and things like that. Very lyrical. I would say the word would be lyrical. That the Cornish Ganseys have got a beautiful texture to them, which you don't see in other Ganseys. So they sometimes look as if the rippling of the water. They're beautiful, aren't they? They are. In their own way. They're very different. Very different.
So we're just thrilled that there are all these different sets of skills and beautiful patterning to explore, and it's great that so many of them are different.
Yeah, we get so excited. I mean, we do. It's just like, you have this Gansey in front of you and you hold it, and it's quite magical. Mm-hmm.
There's been people asking about the patterns, and you'll be pleased to know that Freya Lynn has posted your web address. so if anybody is looking for that information, it's in the chat box at the moment.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, lovely.
Addy also asked, I love the fact that you use pencil and graph paper. Are you ever tempted by the computer programs available?
No.
Simple answer.
No, I have. Sheila's husband makes up a lot of our charts from my drawings or from yours.
Well, I've been doing a lot of.
Sheila's now been doing all a few of the charts too. He's created a special way of doing it, and we have somebody else that helps too.
And she uses one of the bespoke knitting programs.
The point is about working by chart. It's something that I learned a very long time ago when I first was on Sky, and I shared a studio with the wood engraver Kathy Lindsley. She taught me about the importance of balance and light and dark in any piece of work that you make. And she used the tiny wood engraving tools to make a mark into her boxwood blocks. So I started using tiny symbols to get that same effect of light or dark. So when I look at my charts in just pencil, I can see if there's too much dark or not enough balance in the whole, and then I can adjust it. I can't see the same on a computer screen. It feels too removed from the physical process of drawing, and I just love doing that. So it's just my own personal thing. I mean, I do a lot of, I make up huge charts to size for a garment. For example, we did an enormous ball gown for Edinburgh International Fashion Festival, and charted the whole bodice, which again was knitted actually by Sheila in the round. But I like to make things like a seamstress would to a degree. I make up paper patterns of the shape and form, so I can lay my knitting on it and check it as I'm going. Obviously, because when you're working to deadlines, you don't want to rip things back. You want it to be the right sizing. Everything has to be perfect first time. You don't get a second chance at it.
There's lots of other comments in the chat box at the moment. I'm not sure we've got time for me to read them all out loud, but we'll leave it open for a while so everyone else can read it, and we'll let you have a chance as well after the talk, Di and Sheila. Questions for people who've not managed to get into the chat box. Elizabeth, did you want to ask a question? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Obviously, fashion companies find you and ask you to make really exciting pieces, but is there one thing that you would really like to have time to make?
Oh, I'm wearing this beautiful sweater at the moment, which Sheila made for me for Christmas and gave to me on my birthday.
Well, yes, there was a delay of a few months.
Because I don't make for myself. I've never made pieces for myself. I always work with a muse in mind. So right from the very beginning, I don't knit for me.
No, it's a struggle to get you to wear your own designs. It's a real struggle.
I don't do that. Yeah, I like the notion of knitting to give away, to give to people. So,
but anything that you've not been asked to make that you want your imagination just to let rip?
Oh, there's loads of things. Oh gosh, absolutely. I mean, my brain just is full of things that. One thing I would really like to do is actually apply what I've learned within medicine, within creating maybe, you know, like special stockings or knitted things that are knitted with materials that improve healing and circulation, that are natural fibres, not necessarily man-made fibres, because I think there could be applications for things like that. That would be a really worthwhile, interesting thing to do, or even, you know, internally for internal things. I'm sure that there is some way of bringing it, connecting it in, and you know, somebody did talk to me about that a few years ago. So I'm always open for leaping out of the box and applying something that I've learned in a completely different way. Having said that, I would quite like to make a long ball gown again. That was quite inspiring to do. And we've done some pretty crazy things in the last few months, which we can't even talk about till next year.
No.
So really crazy, really amazing. And that will all become clear next year.
Thank you. That's very exciting.
It's definitely going to be something pretty special. Yeah.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
Is that Figgy turned up to say that he'd like something knitting, Elizabeth?
Oh,
Sure, he would love to knit.
Got another question here from Alicia. asking if you've ever thought of reaching out to local museums of ports that have RNLI to see if they have any undiscovered patterns.
Well, interestingly, I do believe
Oh, it looks like we're getting a tea towel displayed as well.
absolutely. Now, I think there are other museums around the coast that are doing some fascinating research and projects. And I believe that it might be in Sheringham. There is a RNLI Gansey, which has got specific things on it which are specific to the RNLI. So obviously people that have worked in, you know, fishing or at sea are also involved in the RNLI, because it is one and the same to a degree. You know, it's like mountain rescue, and you know, like when I was living on Skye and going up the mountains, up the Coolin, most of my friends that were doing that were also in the mountain rescue. So I think that's a great idea. You know, I think that the museum in Anster is definitely connected with Sheringham and with other museums, so that as the project grows, that more and more knowledge will flood in, and that we will actually, you know, all learn from each other, which is the crucial thing before it's too late, you know, before some of the really old Ganseys are gone. You know, I think that's really important.
We're getting some really lovely comments in the chat box. We've got Dottie saying that it was wonderful and she hopes someday you might be able to come to see us in Alaska. There are some examples there. We've got someone in Australia saying they're so glad they woke up at 5 AM to join you. Your passion and talent is absolutely inspirational. Currently in the process of designing and thinking about second Gansey, and you've given so much. Hank Person loved all this. Thanks so much. So many. We'll have to share it all with you, Di, but lots of lovely comments.
Oh, in the chat. Lovely. That is brilliant. Yeah, we've got there as well. We have people in the Nicht club. We have a Nicht club. It's online at the moment, but we have people that have made their own Ganseys in Nicht club and designed their own beautiful Ganseys. So we love hearing from people about what they're planning, what they're making. It's such a brilliant thing to do, to design. You made one for your husband, didn't you, Sheila, for Christmas? I did. It was absolutely beautiful. Mm-hmm.
I cheated, so you're allowed to cheat. I cheated because I had a window of really just a couple of weeks over Christmas last year, which isn't really enough time to knit a traditional 5-ply Gansey on very fine needles. So I cheated and I used a thicker yarn and thicker needles. But it all turned out. It
was beautiful with saddles, everything.
It all turned out. It all turned out beautifully. So for those whose heart fails at the thought of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stitches on fine needles, there are other options. There are other options, and as long as you choose your yarn and make sure that you have good stitch definition. Do some samples.
Yeah, make some samples.
Then it will be beautiful. So absolutely. Yes, there you are. I cheated.
Jen has put
very honest. What an admission to make. What an admission to make. But there you go.
Jen has put the address of the website for the project that you're working on with the Scottish Fisheries Museum in the chat box. If anybody's interested in taking a look at that, the website
absolutely.
www.scottishgansey.org.uk, and the project's called Knitting the Herring. And Jen says that the museum's very lucky to have you both involved.
Oh, well, thank you, Jen. Well, it's a delight for us.
We're loving it. So some of the Ganseys that we have been talking about this evening with such enjoyment and pleasure are on that website. The one I'm pretty sure the one with the Anster tree.
Yes, there is. It is.
There's
I'm not sure if it
I'm
is.
not sure, but anyway, there are some absolutely beautiful Ganseys there, and it's a fantastic website
And resource.
and resource, and we have it bookmarked.
It's bookmarked.
Bookmarked on our computers
Yeah.
For instant access.
And
So-
Jen, particularly, some of you know, the knowledge that she has and the museum has about individuals, people from
local people
here, and you know, their Gansey stories are quite amazing. And if anybody wants to knit a herring, there is a pattern there, and Sheila, there's a little explanation on how to do the tail on the website, and Matthew from Eriskay has added an Eriskay fish
So there's
the mix,
a Scottish East Coast version,
and there's an Eriskay West
and
Coast.
then there's an Eriskay version. The differences are fascinating.
The difference, yeah.
But each of these herring reflects exactly the part of the country that they were.
Yeah. Yes, like the crab
Yes.
thing, crab
Yes.
pot.
The crab pot that everyone got wrong for a
That
long,
everyone
long
got
time.
wrong for a long, long time, and just made it an ordinary triangle. And when we looked at in depth at the actual knitting, it was actually had this extra section at the top, which clearly made it into a crab pot, and that was from that specific place.
So each is from his own. Each of the herring is from its own place.
And sometimes, like this amazing tree, there is there's a little bit of humour in there, because when you look at it en masse on the garment, for a moment it could be a shoal of herring and not just the tree. And the tree, you know, was a very important symbol, tree of life. But also when you look at this Gansey, it does look as if there's an awful lot of silver darlings kind of.
If you turn it on its side, then the herring, you see the herring bones. So
Very clever.
it is so clever.
It is clever.
It is so, so clever.
And I know from working with knitters for 40 years now that, you know, there's so much humour in knitting, and within conversations between knitters. It's an amazing community.
Excellent. Elizabeth, you've got a question.
I'm sorry, but I'm just fascinated. You spend so long doing such detailed work, planning these patterns. How on earth were they done 50, 100 years ago? I'm guessing there was no graph paper. And was it just eye and experimentation?
Yeah, I think, well, we did find these incredible notes, and some had little drawings. And actually that's how I start off a lot of mine, with dots, and dashes and little, you know, I mean, tiny little scribbles.
But the interesting thing was about these notes, because you couldn't really call them a pattern as such. They were notes, but they were written on all sorts of little odds and ends of paper.
Fascinating.
Like you might have, if you have, well, pre the world of computers, you might have copied down a recipe from somewhere on just a little sheet of paper.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is somehow, this is what survived.
Yeah.
I have no idea how they survived for decades.
Probably in books.
But they did.
Because I found recipes from my mum in books.
Yeah, well, that's true.
And people will have shot them in, and
that's true. But the rest will have been down through the generations. I learned to knit, and Di did too, from an aunt when I was very young, and that was the sort of skill that was passed down, and so I think a lot of it was sort of intergenerational.
Yes,
word
knowledge.
of mouth, and the time that these women spent together?
Yeah. I mean, my aunt would, and she was only 4'11" and very feisty and tiny. She wasn't a real aunt. She was kind of just a special friend of the family. And she used to take me to London every year on the train. And I'd stay with her for 2 weeks in London. And my parents would be working there. And she'd look after me and take me to all the fashion houses and everywhere and treat me to tea and Claridge's and all sorts of amazing things. And if she saw a lovely jumper, she literally would take off down the street. And I learned from her to do that. She would take off down the street and even tap people on the shoulder, and this little person, you know, with her handmade gloves, because we used to pick up gloves that she'd had made and shoes from different artisans. She'd say, "Oh, do you mind if I just have a little look at your sweater? It's so nice." And then she would just, it was just imprinted. And so I learned how to do that. And I did chase somebody down Bond Street once and tapped the poor woman on the shoulder, and she nearly had a heart attack. So I don't quite do it with such enthusiasm these days. But
I mean, it does still get done in places like Shetland, not this year, obviously, sadly. But if you ever had the opportunity to go to Shetland during Shetland Wool Week, you would see people stalking each other, following each other up and down streets.
How did they do that?
Coming up to you in a cafe and saying, you know, tell me about your jumper and so on. But then that's a
knitterly thing.
It's a knitterly thing to do because actually it's a compliment.
Yeah, it is.
It's a great compliment. People love to be knitters love to be asked. You know,
it's a language as well.
Where it came from, and
it's a real language, isn't it? Because I was trying to explain something over the phone. I think between you and I, we were having a discussion on the phone about a knitting section, and somebody once said to me, "I have absolutely no idea what you've been talking about for the last 15 minutes. It's complete gobbledygook." And it was just us discussing knit stitches, purl stitches, what we're going to do with this one, where that's going to go. You know, it is a jargon, a language.
I think we're starting to lose people now, unfortunately. So if there's not anybody else with an urgent question, if there is, wave really quickly now, then we'll wrap up the formal part of the evening. But I think, Diane, Sheila, you're happy to stay around a little bit longer informally for a bit more chat, are you?
Yeah, a tiny bit longer, yeah.
Okay, that's great. So if I could ask everybody to unmute themselves, I'll just give you a moment to do that. And if we could give Di and Sheila a rousing round of applause to thank them very much for a really fantastic and informative.
Oh yes, do the video, right?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. That's lovely.